Good evening. My name is Anu Giri and I'm a trustee of Tara Arts and your host for this evening's Table Talks, a series of 3 talks looking at different aspects of race and identity. Tara Arts was set up in 1977 as a direct response to the racist murder of a Sikh boy, Gurdeep Singh Chagga, in Southall that year. Tara's aim was to use theatre to tell diverse stories and help combat the brutal racism of the 1970s. 44 years on, and while the world has changed in many positive and wonderful ways, sadly, the murder of yet another person of colour, George Floyd, has highlighted the deep-rooted racism that still exists within our society today. Social justice remains a central tenet of our bold new vision for Tara Arts, led by our new executive team, Abdul Shaikh and Helen Jeffries. And we hope our Table Talk series will help shed some light on these issues and provide space for debate, reflection, and action. In tonight's discussion, we will be exploring the concept of unconscious bias and how it impacts the casting in the theatre industry. Drawing on the research by our first panellist, Dr Pragya Agarwal, an award-winning behavioural and data scientist whose new book, Sway, Unravelling Unconscious Bias, was the Guardian Book of the Week and named as one of the best science books of 2020. Joining Pragya is theatre actor, writer and singer Yasmin Wilde, who has worked across theatre, film and TV in the UK and internationally in a career that spans over 30 years. And also Anne McNulty, who was casting director and creative associate at Donmar Warehouse Theatre for 20 years and has worked as a freelance director since 2013. So we're going to start by exploring this concept of unconscious bias. It's a term that suddenly in the last few years become very prevalent, and there's lots of unconscious bias training now in organisations. And when we're talking about racism, this concept keeps coming up. So I'd like to turn to Pragya, to you first, to tell us more about what this unconscious bias means and where does it sit in relationship to sort of racism, which is a term that we all know and understand.
Thank you, Anu. So yes, unconscious bias is something which is also called implicit bias, which means that these are the biases or prejudices that we hold within us that we might not be consciously aware of, but they might intentionally or unintentionally affect our decisions and interactions with other people and how we perceive them. Some of these biases we need in our brains to be able to process all the information that's coming to us. So very simplistically speaking, we have kind of a dual processing system where we have a system one processing where all the information that comes at us, we process in a very quick way, matching it to the existing patterns or templates in our brain. And these existing patterns and templates are shaped by our experiences and memories, which means that they can be stereotypes of other people. So when these are stereotypes and we match them to this existing templates, we can judge people really very quickly or judge situations really quickly without taking in new information, without taking the time to process this information rationally. And so especially when we are in a rush or in a hurry or when we are under threat or feel fearful of something, these biases can really manifest themselves in our actions and decisions. So some of these biases are just there to process information, to reduce the cognitive load, but some of them, as we know, can be quite harmful and toxic in the way we process information, and they can perpetuate, reinforce some of the systemic inequalities. So as we know, racism is the term that we often use, the way that inequalities or imbalances in the way different races, which is race is a social construct, but its effect of how they're arranged due to history of oppression and legacies of oppression, these hierarchies can manifest in form of systemic imbalances or structural inequalities. And besides these systemic inequalities, we also live in the system. So we take on this information, absorb it without sometimes being aware of it. And these can affect our perceptions of people or stereotypes that we carry. And so it's kind of a cycle that through our individual and interpersonal biases or prejudices, we can reinforce or enable some of these systemic inequalities while we're constantly actually learning from it and reinforcing our stereotypes. So these biases are really harmful in the way that racism can manifest. And racism is not just, as we know, hate crimes or explicit discrimination or graffiti, but it also exists in form of polite discrimination or microaggressions, polite racism. And a lot of this polite racism or microaggressions are actually a result of our unconscious biases.
Do you think there's a danger in that term, unconscious bias, that people will go, oh, you know, I just can't help it. It's unconscious. Is there a danger in the way that we're using it?
Not in the way that we are using it, but in the way that maybe it is understood sometimes. And I think one of the reasons why I wrote the book Sway was because I was seeing around me that this word there's a real danger that it was becoming a buzzword. It was becoming sort of a trend that organizations were using as a box ticking thing. Oh, we've dealt with unconscious bias, so let's send a staff to unconscious bias training without a complete understanding of what these biases are and what they do and how they're formed in the brain. And so through the book, I really wanted to disrupt some of these myths and misconceptions and to show that actually these biases are not unconscious in the way that we are not aware of them, or not genetically hardwired in us, as some of the media sometimes claims that we can't do anything about it, but these are learned through a lifespan, and which means that they can be unlearned as well. And unconscious bias doesn't mean that we can't help it. We have to take responsibility and accountability for this, for any of the biases that we hold. So holding stereotypes and biases is often not a problem as per se as being activating these biases and stereotypes in the way that we judge people. So we can really control and reflect on our biases and its impact on people. But for that, we really have to understand how these biases are formed in the first place.
Okay, that's very clear. And moving on to you, I mean, given that, you know, we're all born and have a level of unconscious bias, how do you, as a casting director, put that aside when you're casting and remain sort of objective in your job?
Well, I think there's a range of things, and in a way, what's fabulous about what Pragya's given us is that, you know, I come from an era that's pre giving that term to the limitations that get placed because of the way people think or express themselves about the job that they're doing, and in my case, the actors that they're looking at. So I guess the practical thing is to say I like Pragya's alternate for saying it's implicit. And in a way, I guess, from a casting director's point of view, and you know, it's something I learned over time, is that the team I'm dealing with are a group of people who are set on an intentional creation that needs a group of amazing actors to interpret, so that realistically one's wanting to go to the widest possible group, and that in a sense one's trying to be as open and as honest and as fair as possible. But that when you look back to interpretations of unconscious bias and you begin to do what Pragya says, reflect, you realize that you're trying to devise a system where everything's as fair and as open as you can possibly make it. So in a sense, the awareness as opposed to a setting of a system is the first step for me. And I'm, I guess, the person who's at the front line, exploring the information and the widest possible range of choices. So awareness to begin with, and then you add more things in, I think, looking back.
And how do you, have you had instances, obviously you're working with directors and, you know, you've got clients that you're working to. Can you tell us about how do you persuade them? And is there a story of where you've, you know, had to really fight? I'm sure you've had to do it many times, where you've had to really fight for them to have somebody because they've been too narrow in their view. How do you sort of shake them out of their perceived sort of way of working?
It's interesting because I think in a way, even when I was thinking this through and preparing, I don't think I haven't got an absolute example. I've got a reference point where I think sometimes people, sometimes what's gone before is what others have absorbed. So even to do with a physicality, even to do with a kind of how one role connects to another role. So it feels like on the journey, it's been less about whether you've got a white face or a black or brown face, but much more about the quality of the work that's coming to you, and the actor's skills that you're searching for. And sometimes it's about, I've done the research and I know my world, and I've seen work that the actors have done. So that's what I bring. So I'm a kind of lobbyist, I guess, a kind of advocate, where you go, in a way, you go, what have you seen this person do that seems appropriate and correct? And you go, sometimes you've absolutely seen something that feeds into it. And sometimes it's about your complete instinct that tells you they're worthy of a meeting because something they've done already, or something you've seen them do at a drama school, or just within the context of a group of actors, tells you that they're worth your time to see and to try out. So I think in a way, that's where you persuade people. And in a way, you're also looking at a range. You're not just going, it's this one person or that one person. It's several different people, all of whom bring a range of gifts, which could be suitable for that particular role in that context.
Okay. Yasmin, how does this translate when you're auditioning and going for a job? How does it feel to you as an actor? And are you very aware of people's biases when you're going for a role?
I think, I mean, if you're in the room, if you got the audition, there's already been somebody making bold choices, and someone's already open to you. So in a way, being in the room you've overcome, or they've overcome, some bias anyway. And once I'm in the room, and I can only speak about myself really, I think probably some of what Anne was saying really resonates, because it's about awareness. Because sometimes you get a feeling, hang on, am I too grateful to be in the room? Your own unconscious bias or your own self-limiting beliefs about whether you deserve to be there, they can be very damaging, I think, in an audition, which is, any actor will tell you, is such a sort of fragile experience. A small mistake or a strange joke you make can seem to shatter an audition. And I think for me, thinking about this and knowing that we were talking about this, I've really thought about some of the things that have affected me. And I think for me, I have to really look back and ask, where have we been, to sort of examine how I feel now. And just to give some context, I was at drama school about 30 years ago. And when I was at drama school, the headmaster gave us all professional advice. And when he got to me, he just said, I just can't see you in anything. And he just said, look, you're not brown enough to be in Asian parts, and there isn't any Asian work anyway. And he said, your name is too Asian to play white parts. So I changed my name. My name was Faruqi, which is a Pakistani name. And to be honest, I was quite happy with that, because, and then a lot of actors my age will talk about this, I kind of had been subconsciously whiting up for the entire experience at drama school. At the drama school then especially, I was trying to conform. I wanted to be Juliet Stevenson, and there was no thought about colour being a benefit in any way. I was and that's where colourblindness sometimes makes me feel uncomfortable, because is it that we want to sort of pretend that isn't there, the colour, rather than now I feel we might be coming to a time where we celebrate it more. So that's the kind of origins. That's what I've internalized a little bit. And through the years, that has definitely improved. Like, there was a time having a black face in a Shakespeare was like, why have they, that's ridiculous. And now it's a bit ridiculous if there isn't one. But even so, you'd go to these big theatres, maybe you'd be in a company of Asian actors or black actors who were doing our black version of Macbeth or whatever it is, and you go into these big institutions which you idolize, and they're generally white houses, and as a company you're very welcomed, but there is a sort of feeling that within yourself maybe that you're a kind of poor relation, or you're definitely slightly other. You definitely don't feel part of that narrative of that theatre, that they've kind of invited you in or they've included you, but that feels like they could easily exclude you at any minute. Do you know what I mean? So these are very subtle, and I think it's really important not to blame those people, because I understand where they come from, because I've come from the same inherent biases myself. So today when I go into an audition, and sometimes if I'm up for, say, Lady Capulet, I have to think to myself, right, I'm not Juliet Stevenson, so I'm not going to do I've got Pakistani, Austrian heritage. I come with all this fantastic stuff that makes me in my own life feel like a rounded person, and I've got to somehow harness that and bring that to an audition. And to that, you've got, so the last thing you want to feel when you walk in is grateful to be there or resentful that you haven't been given enough chances. So I think, to answer your question in a very long way, it doesn't come, I don't walk in the room and think, oh, you're looking at me like I'm Asian. And it's more a subtle sort of shifting foundations that maybe affect the way you present yourself. And I'm very glad to say that I think younger Black and Asian actors don't seem to be holding on to some of those things. They appear to be taking their space much more confidently, and they are helping us and there was a generation above me that really had to push through some genuine brutal racism to get on stage. So it's a narrative that starts back there and hopefully will move forward, keep progressing.
And do you think drama schools are better now? What you described sounds horrific to us now in kind of 2021 to hear someone say that. Do you think they've gone on a journey to sort of really supporting?
I don't know, because I haven't been to drama school lately, but I have been really interested to read about the trouble that a lot of drama schools have. And I think the problem is that they're generally run by people my age who are used to that old vanguard and who feel like they're really progressive and are trying their best to be open-minded, but they've got a young cohort, like their students are young and they expect more, and there's a sort of pull. I think that's where the tension might come. But I do know a lot of drama schools are inviting people in to try and dig out some of these issues, and some of these people that come in and guest direct and make ridiculous comments, I think they are addressing it now, whereas when I was at drama school, the things that were said were would make your hair curl. So I do think they've got a problem, but I think they realize it now.
Yeah, okay, that's great. I just want to move us on to, you touched on stereotyping. And obviously stereotyping is a device, as you mentioned, Pragya, as well. It's a tool in storytelling, it's a tool in theatre. You have them so the audience can very quickly understand who the characters are and you can get on with telling the story. So it can be a very good tool. But Anne, how do you deal with stereotypes when you're casting?
Well, I think the thing is, again, it's the same thing where you go, I don't come into the room going, I'm just going to tell everybody in here that they can't do any stereotyping. That I'm, in a way, by that point, what the play that's been chosen, the roles that are up for offer and how those roles have been described, and what the ambition of the director, and in the early days when I was building base, what the production, the producer and the whole team were looking for was to, build an opportunity to, it's just a practical thing where you go, I understand now looking back something about how that reads, but at the time I didn't have a sense that only one way of doing it would be the acceptable way, or one style of choice would be what was required. So I guess I feel like somewhere my role in the whole play, in the whole circumstance, is more of an agitator, so that in a sense one's questioning how the director's wanting to look at something, one's questioning about how the producer and the artistic director, because they have a view in how these things get chosen and pulled together. So there's a bigger group, and that in a way one can add one's voice. I can't stop them doing something, but I can make enough noise, or at least be practical about questioning and challenging as required. But it won't necessarily have, in my head, computed as that feels stereotypical, so I'm not going with it. Do you see what I mean? Yeah. In a sense, we've got much more au fait and much more searching about the terms alone that describe what's been going on and what's been happening. That recognition and also the moment now where we're addressing these inconsistencies and hurtful decisions that have happened consistently, that at the time it didn't appear so clear. or so, what's the word? So that you could actually quantify in the way we are now doing it. I think that's it, that I'm acknowledging to a great extent that in some circumstances, it didn't appear like that, or I'd said as much as I could say and decisions still went ahead. So I think that's somehow how I perceive it.
Yeah. Pragya, could you tell us a bit more about stereotyping? Because you talk about it in your book. And what are the positive benefits and what are the negative benefits of stereotyping?
So what a stereotype is, as Anne and Yasmin have been talking about as well, is basically a kind of norm that's imposed on somebody or something, saying that this is how this kind of person should be, or this is how this kind of situation should be. So it then becomes kind of a norm in society. It becomes the acceptable way to be. A stereotype, as I also said, it's kind of a pattern or a template that people just impose on different new situations and new people. So if this kind of person acted like this in the past, they're going to act like this in the future as well, which means that we can make really hasty, rushed decisions about people. So as soon as somebody walks into an audition room, if a person sees a person who looks a certain way or who's dressed a certain way, who has tattoos or piercing, who has hair a certain way, people can make really quick decisions about and judgments about, oh, this person's not going to be good, or this person's not going to be as brilliant, because they have a certain perception in their mind about that. And so that can affect their judgment. It can also affect in the way that we create affinity with certain people. So when we see somebody and it matches our stereotype of what an able or capable or a good or a talented person is, it can result in kind of a halo bias, that we give more weight to all the positive attributes that they have and negate some of the negative attributes that they have, which means that while we think we are being very rational, that is unconsciously affecting our decision about. So that is there, but also there's the stereotype threat, which I think Yasmin touched on a little bit, about when we know or when we have this feeling from our past experiences or from other people's experiences that we might be stereotyped in a particular domain, we carry this notion of stereotype threat, which can affect our performance, because a lot of our cognitive load is going into overcoming that anxiety associated with stereotype threat. We have this thing of not fitting into that particular domain, or we might have this feeling that we don't deserve to be here, or we're not going to be valued. So we're going to have to work 10 times as hard to prove ourselves that we belong in this space. And that can take up so much resources that can affect our performance. So it becomes kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy in a way. So that is there as well. In some cases, there's the notion of benevolent stereotypes as well, which I've discussed in the book also, where sometimes to counter some of the negative stereotypes, sometimes things like, oh, all Asians are really good at maths or science, or all of certain kind of people are really good at singing or acting, or very physical or good athletes, those kind, or women are very nurturing or creative. Those kind of benevolent stereotypes are created as well. But what stereotype is homogenizing a group of people and not allowing us to be individuated within them. And it's putting people into boxes and niches, which means that we are completely labeling them without judging or being able to evaluate people on their own merit. So benevolent stereotypes are quite harmful as well. Yes, stereotypes are an easy way of processing information, but that also stop us from taking in new information when we need it.
I would agree with that, because I mean, the thing you were saying about people being great at singing, or, you know, I think if you look at the West End, there's very good stats. You know, it looks like a very diverse, the musical theatre scene, for instance, seems very diverse. But actually, if you really drill down on it, there's a good representation of Black actors, because I think that's the stereotype. You know, people accept that there'd be great singers and performers. It's much harder to get seen as an Asian actor in musicals, unless it's a Bend It Like Beckham or, you know, a Prince of Egypt situation. So it's one of the areas where sometimes it seems that the trouble with being put in a BAME sort of category, you can really miss something that maybe needs to be looked at. And with the characterizations, like, for instance, if you've got a script and there's a really sassy best friend who makes a lot of like witty remarks, and she's maybe a bit, you know, sort of like voluptuous and cool and earthy, and they want to get an ethnic actor for that, they will probably go for a Black girl. And that's, you know, those parts are great. And I've seen a lot of Black women in those roles and they're brilliant. But, you know, wouldn't it be interesting if it was a Korean actress or, you know, like a little Chinese girl or you know, a big Asian woman like myself? But you know what I mean? It's kind of, because we see something a lot, it becomes really comforting when we see it again. And all it takes is for someone to break the mold. And I just think that would really open up quite a lot of things. You know, we often see things think, oh, this is comforting because I sort of know what's going to happen. I sort of know, oh, she's gonna die, you know, she's gonna be really funny. And at the end of it, you think, you know, it's not as enriching. So I just think it's self-limiting. It's limiting for the actor, but it's maybe limiting for the production. Who knows?
Yasmin, how do you, I mean, obviously, how does it translate, the stereotyping, the kind of typecasting? What's your experience been, and has it changed over your career?
It's really hard to say, because as you age, you go into different categories, so you can't really compare. I mean, as a young woman, I think actually being not a size 10 was a huge thing, you know, so you are never put in the central part of a love story if you're not thin. And you think, well, are these women who are not thin, are they not at the center of their own love stories in all their lives? You know, surely we're allowed to have husbands, but you know, so there's that. And I did notice, if you're, some of my friends were very, very beautiful Asian actresses, and they got work because there is a sort of stereotype of that mysterious dark lady who comes in and sort of has an affair with, you know, there's, you know, and they get, or the sharp lawyer or the doctor, or, you know, if we're in the EastEnders saying, oh, what are you, a doctor or a lawyer kind of thing? And it was a joke. And it's what you were saying about positive stereotypes, because, you know, they're sometimes really nice parts. But I think the Asian actor is very rarely the cop who's corrupt, or, you know, the really rubbish doctor who keeps messing up. You're always incredibly capable and sharp talking and quite cold. And, you know, so it's just, I can't speak for Black actors because I'm sure they've got their own list of things that they're a bit tired of seeing. But yeah, as you are going through your 20s, you notice that a lot more. As I'm now over, you know, blah, blah, 50, what was really interesting is that I find myself going to a room and I'm with 45 to 70-year-old women who are Black, Asian and South Asian, East Asian. So they've obviously decided that we are the overs, as they have in the X Factor, you know, we're the overs and we are not white. And that's the thing that they wanted. So in some ways, that's really opened things up for me, because I'm, you know, my beautiful friend is in the same room as me and we're up for the same part now. So we're not being judged so much on our attractiveness or, you know, those stereotypes. In some ways, as an older woman, I'm kind of liberated from all that. But then you have other problems, like I'm up for parts with Indian accents now. I don't have any friends who are Asian who have an Indian accent in this country of my age. It's something that people, you know, maybe 10 years older, 20 years older, generally have. But they often want an Indian accent, and you think, well, if you look at the story of this person, they wouldn't have an Indian accent if they came over when they were 10, or, you know. So that's an archetype, I suppose, a mum. And if she's an Indian mum, she must talk in a certain way, and you know, that sort of stuff. So it's just questions, you know, just asking questions of the person. So, you know, if I was in the room with that director, I'd say, would she have an Indian accent? And just ask that really open question.
And how much flexibility do you have once you've got that role? And if it is quite a stereotypical archetype type role, what flexibility do you have as an actor to sort of make it your own and sort of take some of the things out that don't really... I think it's really hard to do that, because often if it's a stereotype part, you know, if you're going in to play a midwife or something, you're there to support the main storyline. So you're not going to have any leeway, which is fine, but you're there because, you know, they think that you look like you might be that, and that's fine. I'm not saying we don't want those roles, by the way. We definitely want to continue those roles, but it's quite hard. And I think if you're, I mean, I have a couple of years ago, I did a silent witness, and the director was so open, but I was playing, it was a bigger part, it was a lot more to her. And she was a hijabi woman, so you know, it was part of her character that she wasn't just there to facilitate the story for another character, if you know what I mean. So the more central you are to the script, the more you can challenge stuff or ask to try other things.
again, I think maybe that's a slightly gendered thing, because I have noticed that boys are better at doing that than girls. I've been on set with men who've just sort of scored stuff out and going, I don't want to say that, or even some of my lines. I don't think she should say that. Whereas women don't necessarily feel like they can do that.
Yeah. I want to move us on to the kind of more recent concept again, or in the recent past, of sort of colourblind or colour conscious casting. I mean, we've seen obviously David Copperfield last year, Bridgerton, The Great, his Dark Materials, a much more multicultural cast. And rather than, it's almost like there's lots of different characters and protagonists without sort of being written as a Asian man or black woman, they just seem to be mixing it up. Anne, have you been able to cast more black and Asian actors because of this? Do you see a sudden shift in what directors are looking for?
Well, I think it's gradual. These things are always gradual, and I think sometimes I haven't worked very much in television, and whether they're more progressive now compared to how they used to be, because there's something about the familiarity of what's gone before and how people adhere themselves to that. And in the theatre, in some ways, because I've been involved with young directors or innovative directors, or some of the projects weren't bound by the specifics. Even an all-female production, which had a massive range of it, oftentimes it's about the context, where you go, there's nothing that's going to bind you to it, so you can go wherever you like but search. And in a sense, I think it's a gradual thing that's happened. I think that the range and quality of acting that's out there is astonishing, and people are recognizing more and more that they can go in a number of different directions. That I think it's true that you have one director and one casting director, one director and one writer, and you won't necessarily get the same group. That somehow the mix can be different in any case. So I think it has shifted. I think it probably quietly was shifting in the theatre, but it's stop and start depending on who you're working with. It's stop and start. I was thinking today about when David Oyelowo played King Henry VI in the Plantagenets trilogy, and it's a place between. It's a young black actor playing a British king. So people were more interested, or at least as interested, in going, God, he's really good in that part. He's so fabulous. But is it really appropriate that a black actor should be playing a British king? But isn't it about the right actor in the right part? And in a sense, it gradually moved on. So you need, Yasmin's referred to this, you need that catalyst where someone just is willing to step outside the contours of what's gone before, or are like, this is the world we live in. Has nobody noticed? I mean, gradually they've noticed bits of it, but now there's a much more wide ranging. And also the nature of producing, I guess, has changed in the sense of widening out. So people recognize what's going on in the world, and they recognize that their audiences require it, demand it, are expecting it, are hopeful for it, so that, it's their job to find those actors who can inhabit, and they don't have to be, there's not some kind of composite that was right and is going to be just perpetuated. I think that's a good thing, a marvellous thing.
Okay. I mean, Pragya, what do you make of this? It feels like it's a positive. When I watch these shows, or I go to the theatre and see a very multicultural cast, it feels very positive. Is it? Is there a dark side to this?
No, it's something I've been reflecting on quite a lot about colorblind casting, and the notion of colorblind, anything makes me uncomfortable, first of all, because when we're talking about colorblind, it seems like we are ignoring skin color, that it has been a barrier for people in the past and still is. We are ignoring the systemic inequalities or the dominant racial hierarchy that exists in our society. We are kind of ignoring. We are saying that your skin color doesn't matter, but that means that all the history of oppression that you bring with you because of that doesn't matter as well. So you're kind of dismissing people's heritage in a way. So I've been thinking a lot about that. And I think it is good that we're seeing multicultural casting. And it is good that directors and producers are opening out and they are making an effort to get the best people in. But how much of it is going to be without any kind of bias in it? That is something that I reflect on. So often companies will say, this is a very multicultural cast, diverse cast. But if you drill down to it and if you note it, then you will see that people of certain ethnicity are actually still being boxed into certain kind of roles. Mm-hmm. If there are many subsidiary roles or many minor roles that have been filled by diverse actors from minority ethnic communities, then the cast can be called diverse, but they're still not getting the main protagonist roles. They're not getting the main roles. They're not getting the roles that really matter or the meatier ones. They're still being pushed into, like Yasmin said, about the sassy friend or the sidekick or the person who acts in a certain stereotypical way. So they're still being put into those roles, just that there are more of them now. That is all, which means that, yes, they're getting a seat at the table, but they might not be getting a voice at the table because they're not involved in the actually making decisions, perhaps, or having any say on the set. They're still feeling grateful for being there, or the gratitude because they know that they're there because not because of their skin color, but so they can't even feel like they are fulfilling any kind of role within the production. So what I'm saying is that I think I have mixed feelings about it. It depends on how it's been done. There are certain advantages to it. And of course, some of the productions have been fantastic. And we see that diversity is actually all inclusive, not just race, but also gender and disability and neurodiversity. And you see actors of all sort in it, and you know that they're there because the best person for the role without their diversity being a feature of it. And they're giving meatier, strong roles and protagonists. They have their own storylines. So I suppose what I'm saying is that maybe there has to be a color conscious element to it, that yes, the skin color does matter, or the diverse element, or whatever this person is bringing does matter. And then the production has to be careful about, are they being fitted into the stereotypical norms? Are they being given this role just because I have an unconscious bias that this person will be better for it than any other person? So I think it's again a matter of reflection and discussion and acknowledgement of these things.
Yeah, there was an interesting... Sorry, I was just going to pick up on something that you said there about colourblindness, because I noticed on with May I Destroy You, I keep calling it that, I May Destroy You, which was this brilliant show which had a lot of black actors in it, as if you don't know, and someone on Twitter who's not very progressive said it was amazing, and within minutes I'd forgotten I was watching black people. And I'm sure that person was trying to be conciliatory, but of course it's a very silly comment, because their colour was such a big part of the show, apart from everything else, and they don't want you to forget that they're black. You know, they're proud of being black, and it's part of the whole story. You know, it's part of the heart of that piece. So I think that is that's the sort of a big example of that danger of what you were saying. And I really enjoyed things like David Copperfield. Because it was so the mixed casting was so it ran right through it. It wasn't sort of layered on top, and because it ran right through it, you stopped questioning it within about 3 seconds. You know, the minute you just sort of, and that's what theatre does anyway. I mean, we're all on a stage, you know, we're pretending, you know. It always makes me laugh that people think you can believe I'm a fairy in fairyland, but you can't believe that there can be I'm not black and I'm also the king. So it makes no sense in theatre.
Have you seen a change, Yasmin? Are you being offered broader parts? Does this translate on the ground? We're seeing I've picked a handful of shows, and there's a handful of theatre productions, but is this translating as an actor on the ground?
I think it probably is for the younger generation. I think there's a bit of an issue with maybe my generation, because when we came out of drama school, we weren't going into the main houses. We did go into rep, and I did some great rep seasons where I was playing, in Sheridan and all kinds of things. There were some really progressive directors in rep, but we didn't necessarily build the same CVs as some of our white counterparts did. and didn't necessarily get onto the same agent level, you know, the top tier, mystical, whatever it is, the inner circle. So I think with now, what I would really like casting directors to do or theatres is to recognise that maybe the people that they need to find, they might not be the 20 Black and ethnic actors that they already use, because what you do see is a lot of the same actors, and they're brilliant. But because I think there hasn't been that same opportunity, and I know personally loads of actors who don't get the recognition or the opportunities, they just don't get in the room, who are absolutely as good as any other actor I've worked with. So I would just say you just maybe need to cast your net a bit wider. You need to maybe look a bit harder, and don't sort of find the first person of colour that you think, oh, they'll be all right, and then turn your back, and sort of mentally you've ticked that off, and it's a very harsh way of putting it. I'm sure that's not how it feels for those people, but that's how it feels for us. Like, oh, we've already got an Asian actress in this, and it would sort of confuse the audience if we have two. So I think there's maybe work to be done in just being a bit more proactive in searching for new blood. And as I say, I think maybe the young people coming out of drama school and the younger generation have it a little bit, you know, they've sussed it a bit better than maybe my generation did.
I want to move us on to the future. We've talked a bit about what the barriers are to casting, and you know what the issues are. But looking ahead, what are we moving towards? Like, what's the ideal? What would you all like it to look like? Theatre and casting, and you know, the kind of you know, because there's sort of slight, yes, colourblind, but slight misgivings around that as well. So I don't know who'd like to kick off, but what would you like the future to look like? What would make the difference, do you think, to make theatre more egalitarian?
I think, if I may start, I'm not from the theatre. I think that diversity has to go right through not just in terms of the actors who are on stage, but through the whole industry. I think the people who are making the decisions, people who are writing the scripts, the kind of stories that are being told, the kind of stories that get commissioned, the kind of scripts that get commissioned, the kind of actors then who get cast onto it. It has to go right through the heart of it, I think, so that there are people who are making these decisions are also the one who don't have this affinity bias, that they are only seeking the stories that they can relate to, or they speak to them. And we all look for things that are relate to us. And so if we only have a certain kind of people, we'll only get certain kinds of stories in theater or in films or television, whatever. And then that means that people don't see themselves on stage. And so then it kind of creates that kind of domino effect, that young people are not seeing themselves in role models and representation. So they feel this is not for me, because if I go into it, that these are the kind of risks that I have to entail, or this is not the industry for me because I'm not welcome there. So they already go in with kind of a stereotype threat. And I think there has been changes, of course, but as I hear from a lot of younger people who've gone into drama or music or films, they still are feeling some of these kind of effects of being stereotypes or typecast, or not enough roles, or that they have to act a certain way if they want to get certain roles. Yeah, I mean, I think that there are sometimes people create a narrative of what an Asian or an Indian woman, for instance, should be like, or how they act. So they'll always be there to kind of be playing the one who's being abused, or who's in pain, or who's kind of passive, not people who are really got lots of agency or autonomy, because that's the kind of image or impression people have created. So again, that might tick a box of diversity, but that doesn't really create diversity or inclusivity in the true sense. So I think beyond diversity, we have to look towards inclusivity as well.
So you're really saying we need that kind of the decision makers to be a much more diverse group, and then it'll filter down. And what do you feel? What would make the difference, do you think, in casting or in productions to sort of have a fairer, more equal?
Well, it's elements of everything we've discussed, but taken to the next level. where you go, no, it's not the same, you know, short list of very familiar faces. It's a much what it is about who's writing the stories and which stories are being told, and so therefore it's about what's being programmed. It's about, you know, what audiences want in terms of being challenged to look to their own world, but also to, in a way, it's about, for me, it's about finding one's way into writing that's universal, but with a modern kick. So that allows for the new faces and the new talents to be drawn in. But also it's about, you know, a 19th century male writer being adapted by, you know, a 21st century Asian woman. Mm-hmm. And somehow the ending of that play, which was the production of A Doll's House at...
Yeah, The Lyric.
Where you go, I don't remember it finishing like that before. I always felt that Nora crept out of that house, you know, in the quiet of the morning with nobody knowing what was going on. But in that version, because of the way the colonialism was set against the modernism, it meant that her voice went right through to the last second, that he argued with her and tried to persuade her, but she was her own person right to the moment. And I hadn't ever seen that before. So in a way, that's a microcosm for me of what I'd be looking for, which is the reinterpretation, which is about as it should or ought to be, so that we can take the decision about what we're left with, that you know what I mean, that we're taken on in our thinking and in our ideas. I think that's it. And also it's a little bit about, you know, within the theatre industry, all the creative parts to do with design and lighting and all the people coming through there, where at the moment there just aren't enough recruits that we're searching and seeking, but that it's tougher. That not everybody knows those jobs are worth doing, and at the moment where the theatre industry is, it's going to be a big question to step in and to go, yes, but the new theatre industry will be better and will be formulated by a wider group of people who are informing everything at every level. So it is, you know, as you've said once before, utopian, but I think you have to move in that direction and be trying to draw that group of people together.
Yasmin, what's your aspiration?
Yes, I agree with everything Anne said, actually. That I saw that production of Tanika Guptas' version, and it was amazing. And I've been in her version of Hobson's Choice twice. And what she does amazingly is, and she's brilliant at writing her own things, but when she adapts, is she knows what not to change. Often you don't have to change those characters too much. And that's because we're all the same, you know. It takes you away from that trap of stereotyping, you know, because actually these characters were written in one way, but we're all the same. But anyway, that's a side note. I think for me, it's I don't know practically. I think the way we're going is brilliant, and I think there's a subtle shift that needs to happen, which is between we've been excluded and now we're included, and I think there's another step, which is belonging. And this is, I don't know if anyone's heard of John A. Powell, but I was watching some of his speaking about this and talking about when you're included, you're kind of just let in, and you don't ever feel like you have that agency, but when it goes the extra step and you have belonging, then together you can create and form this new start. You know, together the theatres can, if we're really included genuinely and we have proper entitlement to be there, I think that will push everything. And a lot of these questions of people feeling uncomfortable about, am I allowed to, you know, say there's a quota or am I not, you know, all those really uncomfortable people trying their best, but feeling like they're caught between, you know, being politically correct. And I think all that will sort of disappear if there is a genuine belonging of people, because, you know, historically companies like Tara and Talawa and Carly Theatre, you know, these companies that rose from the grassroots really have done a lot of the heavy lifting of pushing and giving actors of colour experience and pushing us to the fore. And those theatre companies are still really needed. But I think what we need is less of a kind of apartheid system where, you know, and even though it feels like we're so included now, I think there's another step. But I couldn't tell you what it looks like. I think it just requires everyone in this process to ask themselves really honest questions. Just really say, am I employing this? Would I employ Tanika Gupta to write a play if there was no Asian characters in it? Yeah, she could write whatever she wants, as far as I'm concerned. She's a genius. But, you know, am I asking her to do my diversity for me? Am I have I got this Asian cast in, and do I now feel like I don't really have to worry about that anymore? You know, really not ask yourself really honest questions that you might be very pleased with your answers. But I think without that kind of exploration, I think we can't push that last bit. And I think everyone would feel relieved for it to be less of a sort of hot topic and more of a really positive topic.
Yes, I think you have something there, is it? It's I too, and I'm sure many of us are just very sick of it being an issue all the time. And every time it comes round, here's the diversity issue, and
it's the problem.
Everyone has to, it's the problem, and everyone has to debate it, and everyone has to talk about it. And it would be very nice to sort of maybe stop being a problem and an issue, and just as you said, very nicely put it, sort of just belonging. I want to finish off our talk this evening by asking each of you how you cope when faced with bias. I mean, all of us will have experienced bias in some shape or form. And what are your tips if people are out there thinking, you know, they're finding it very hard? What are your tips? Is there something you've done or ways of coping? How do you cope when you're faced with it? Anne, do you want to kick us off?
I think I guess my natural style is to be strategic. And by that I mean is to, you know, it's like I say to all my young students, is your preparation is everything. So I know my stuff, I know why, and I know what, and I know who. And in a sense, being able to explain and clarify as a means to describe and persuade feels more, of course, I think where people are, you know, somewhere in the dark ages, one has to call them out. But I think realistically, often one finds that it's just a fear-induced thing where they just don't know if they're ready or whatever that means. So in a sense, it's about what they didn't know that then they do know. That feels to me like a better way of approaching it. I think that's what I've always felt is the key to it, because in a sense you go, I'm not trying to insist, I'm simply opening up the possibilities and keeping the appropriateness in the room, the realistic nature of why this should be moving into with the times, if you see what I mean. I think that's it. I think it's a form of openness, and it's a form of transparency about this is the world we're in, and this is why we need to. But I think it's done by a series of stealthy steps, I think.
Okay. Pragya?
Yeah, I mean, it's harder to address it when it's targeted towards oneself, so towards me. It's important to challenge these things, and it's sometimes easier to challenge explicit biases rather than the more implicit, subversive forms of biases, or, as I said, microaggressions or stereotyping. I think the first instant I always think, is this worth it? Is this worth my time? Or do I have the mental capacity to deal with it right now? Am I stressed enough, or can I take on more stress that comes with dealing with this, tackling with this? And if it is worth it, then I do try and focus on the impact of somebody's actions in the first instance. Because sometimes when you focus on the intent, or people can get really defensive and it can quickly escalate into an unproductive discussion. So if I focus on the impact and say, have you realized that what you've said or done or the way you've acted can have this impact not just on me, but widely or more broadly? And if I can maybe quote some stats or quote some data or something, if there's time, we can sit down and have a conversation about it as well. And when people are open-minded to it, I always like to have a discussion with them. But if there's no time, and if this person's not worth the effort, then sometimes you have to choose your battles as well, while being aware that it's really, really important to challenge these biases and stereotypes.
Yasmin, how do you cope with it?
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, I don't cope with things well when they're aimed at me either. I think the first reaction is often shame, isn't it, when you encounter racism of any kind, even little microaggressions, and then before you know it, the moment's gone. So it's a lot easier to be an ally for somebody else, and I think that's what I would just say. Or if you're white, black, whatever, just call it out, or just ask questions if you see something. Why, I wonder why you said that to her, or I don't know if that's the right, whatever it is, just ask a question, because often I think people are just, it's a habit in many ways. I mean, and we've come a long way. I mean, I've got a friend who was in a show at Big Theatre, their Asian show, and he actually had a meeting with the artistic director and said, I've been in the show, you said you think my performance is good, and I'd really love to be seen for your main seasons, your checkoffs and things. And this director, this is 20 years ago, said, well, I just don't see you in those. It's not naturalistic for you to be in them. And that's my friend felt very sort of relieved that he'd been talked to in that very honest way. And I think that's an example of, nowadays, obviously, my friend would be able to come back and he'd have that strength. I think now we can still ask those questions. And if people come up with these answers, we can, I think after that conversation, that director will have gone away, at least thought about it, because the issue had been brought up. And for him, that was quite a sort of outlandish idea. And I think we still need to just keep asking the questions. I wonder why you said that to me, or I wonder why you think that about, wouldn't it be, but maybe you should rethink that, just to sort of keep prodding and be strong if you can.
I think that brings us to the close of our first table talk. I want to thank the three of you very much for giving up your time and thinking so deeply about the topic and sharing your expertise with us all this evening. I'd also like to say a very, very big thank you to the team at Tara Arts for pulling this together. They've done a fantastic job. There are 2 more table talks in this series, and we'll be exploring subjects of colorism and interracial relationships, and looking at taboos around mental health within Black and Asian communities. So you can stay updated about Tara's upcoming events by following us on social media. You can see the handles on your screen now. And it just remains for me to thank all of you for joining us this evening and for being open and engaging with the debate. And I wish you a very good evening and see you soon.